Welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us today for our coffee chat. I'm Amy Klaus, Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Products at Brooks Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Judy Carta and Dr. Robin Miller-Young joining us today to talk about multi-tiered systems of support and how we can use them with young children to combat the educational inequities caused by the current health crisis. Before we start, I just want to give you a few tips for listening to the webinar. So we recommend you close any applications that take up any bandwidth just to give you a better viewing experience. And if you have any audio problems and you're using computer audio, we recommend you switching to telephone audio in your audio panel and dialing in. That usually helps. And if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them in the questions box that's on the right-hand side of it's in your webinar panel. You can type a question and we'll take those at the end. And today's session is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. And you'll also receive a link to your certificate in your follow-up email. In the chat box, I included a link to the slide handouts for today's presentation, and they're also loaded in the handouts section. So with now, I'm going to turn it over to Judy and Robin. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Amy, and good afternoon or good morning to some of you. My name is Judy Carta, and I'm from the University of Kansas, and have spent a number of years thinking about early MTSS along with my colleague, Robin Miller-Young. Robin?
And I am an assistant professor involved in teacher preparation for early childhood special education at Northern Illinois University. And like Judy, I've also been very involved with a number of different positions in leadership roles in local school districts, most especially in the state of Illinois. Learning how to create system-wide changes so that the experiences young children and families have in our classrooms and in our schools really result in them achieving the kinds of outcomes that are very essential to them.
Great. Well, it's great to be able to have a coffee chat with 200 of our closest friends. Robin and I are really pleased to be able to share a little time with you this afternoon. And what we want to do today is share some thoughts about how the pandemic is affecting young children and how MTSS can be brought to bear to address some of the inequities that are caused by the pandemic. So what we want to do today is to talk about three main questions. First, how might the pandemic affect young children's development and learning? And given that, how can programs be thinking about educating young children and providing services to children in the fall? And then finally, how or why maybe can MTSS be a useful tool in planning to ensure that children are getting the right level of support and instruction? I wanted to let you know that we're going to be leaving you with a lot of resources. So we're going to be blazing through a lot of points this afternoon, leaving you with lots of things for your consideration after our phone call and our conversation is over. So moving right along, one of the things that I've been thinking about for the last few months is really the pandemic is not an equal opportunity disease. It really disproportionately affects people who are Black and brown and also people who live in poverty. And it really goes beyond just the physical risks to individuals in these groups, but it also extends to the consequences that the pandemic will have on children from these groups. And so as educators, I think we need to think about what's happening to children and how we have to get our programs, our schools ready to meet the needs of struggling learners. And I think we know that the children who typically have been struggling learners in our programs will be the ones who are most likely going to be affected by the pandemic. It's the children who are going to be facing social emotional difficulties because of the toxic stress that they're exposed to and the limited opportunities to get cognitive stimulation. So I wanted to just explore some of these different risks that the pandemic might cause and how those risks might affect children's development. And I present this whole list of just some of the risks that the pandemic might have and how they might be affecting children from families in marginalized communities. And you can read this list of risks, but I just wanted you to kind of wrap your head around all the multiple ways that children in poverty might be feeling the effects of COVID-19 when their families are facing losses of jobs, becoming homeless. Families are going to be having a difficult time feeding the families. There's a greater likelihood of these families having people who are sick living in their under their roofs. They're going to be more likely to live in densely populated homes. So all of these risks and many more create family stressors that can then have an impact on kids. So family members' mental health is more likely to be affected. And that makes it much more difficult for families to engage in the kind of responsive interactions with children that we know are so important for children's development.
Hi, Judy. I just want to jump in.
Yep.
Your slides don't seem like they're advancing.
Oh,
So are
no.
they advancing on you? So on your, we're still seeing the title slide. So
Oh, let's see.
it might work best. I can put the presentation on my
Okay,
my computer if you think that
sure.
are.
Even,
I assume they're moving on your. You're probably.
yeah.
Oh no, actually they're moving. Now I see a slide that says reflecting on some of the ways
Yep.
the
Okay.
pandemic. Are we caught up?
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Oh, well, I apologize for that. Thanks for breaking in, Amy. But I think that what you heard reflects a lot of those risks that you saw on that title slide. And the risks that I was just talking about are the ways that children can be affected because their families are affected by multiple stressors. But then there's also a whole set of stresses and risks that are brought about by the fact that children may be losing out on their early education or childcare opportunities. So, I think we know that that not being in childcare can affect all children, but it probably will affect children in poverty in even more profound ways. I think we know that children in poverty, school is such a source of stability and predictability. And especially for children who don't have much predictability in their home environments. We also know that when children don't have childcare or early education opportunities, the loss of social interaction and the loss of learning opportunities will be especially great for children who might not be able to have these opportunities through things like remote learning, or because their families aren't equipped to interact with them as much because of all the stressors that they're working underneath. So there are many ways that the unavailability of early education programs will affect children in poverty. And then one other point that I wanted to make about the pandemic is that not only will children in poverty be more likely to be affected by the pandemic in multiple ways, but I think we also know that they're probably going to be affected longer in time because they are the children who come from families who will be affected by the loss of jobs for a longer period of time, and also because their child care centers are less likely to reopen once the immediate pandemic is over and things start to open up. And so as a result of many of these factors that I just described, I think a gap in learning and achievement between children from lower income families and those from upper income families is likely to be larger than ever and to last for a longer period of time. And in fact, will grow ever larger over time. One of the things I often do in talking about the achievement gap between high and lower income families and their children is this conceptual figure. And the point that I want to make here is that the achievement gap that that people talk about that occurs in elementary grades starts to emerge when children are younger, when children are even before they reach kindergarten age. And the pandemic will most likely increase the disparity, will increase the space between the high and for children from high and low economic backgrounds. But one thing that is really important to realize is that that difference between high and low income children is not something that is set in stone, that children's trajectories of development are changeable. And so what you see here in this figure are that there are arrows going up from the kinds of things that we know will increase children's trajectories. So we know that children who have things like responsive caregiving and talking and reading when they're young and supportive relationships with parents and children will have higher developmental trajectories. But at the same time, many of the children in poverty will have things that lower their trajectories, like multiple risks or weak social support. But as educators, what we have to remember is we have some of the tools to increase children's trajectories. So that's what we'd like to be focusing on today. Just one other thing that
Yep. Sorry to jump in again. Your slides, so they're not quite caught up. Why don't you try turning off your webcam and see if sometimes it could be a bandwidth issue. So if you turn that off, let's see if that'll sync up. Okay, and now we're not seeing the graph. I think we're 2 slides. If you'll just click forward.
Oh, it should, mine shows, okay, here we go. Not all children will be adversely affected?
Yes, that's what we're seeing now.
Okay. So I guess this is my final point, and that is, I'm really painting kind of a worst case scenario of how poverty affects children. But it's important for us to realize that not all children will be adversely affected. And one of the reasons is that families also often have multiple protective factors that strengthen them and allow them to deal with the multiple risks that they're facing. So things like parents who know how to manage stress, or the social connections that families have, or their knowledge of parenting and child development will all be helpful in dealing with some of the adversity that comes along with COVID-19. So because not all children will be adversely affected, what we as educators have to think about is how will we know who's affected, and how will we be able to get the right amount of intervention and support to the children who need it. And it's almost kind of like thinking about hospitals and needing to triage individuals who come to the hospital. We need to have ways of identifying who needs support, and we need to have those ways of identifying children quickly, and then be able to provide them with the right level of support.
So Judy, if you want to move forward to our slides a little bit, maybe I can take it from here, and I'm going to jump to what would be, I think, like slide number 12. It's the one that says, what is MTSS? So if you want to move us to there, I'll take us forward, kind of helping our participants to see why we are so excited and enthusiastic about this incredible opportunity to use something that could adversely impact families and make them see the ways to be successful in an MTSS type system.
I am, Amy, I'm not, oh, there we go. So about slide 12, did you say?
Right, it has the picture of children with their hands being raised. And so, okay, so to our participants, what we want to share is this very strong passion we have around an evidence-based practice called multi-tiered systems of support. By definition, we would say that it is a whole school data-driven framework for improving the learning outcomes of all children, all students, delivered through a continuum of evidence-based practices and systems. And we'd say, well, then what does that really mean when it comes to what an early MTSS system would be? And why would it be advantageous for programs to think about looking at an MTSS system now with the effects of the pandemic? We would say, well, a strong, well-placed MTSS system means you're going to identify young children who are struggling to learn various kinds of learning targets that might be part of your curriculum, and then also how to perform essential adaptive skills, some of those coping mechanisms, some of those social emotional skills that we know we need to foster in these young children. This is going to be a great opportunity to make sure that we're putting in evidence-based practices so they can acquire those skills. MTSS also means that you intervene early. You do not need to wait for children to show very, very significant delays and to be eligible for early childhood special education. Children are going to be identified as soon as they need the supports. And the competencies we're going to be looking at can be in the early academic areas, in the more traditional developmental domains, as well as social and emotional domains. And on this particular slide, you see a little bit of the compare and contrast between MTSS and what we typically do in early education. In early education, although there are many high quality programs available, we don't usually systematically address the range of individual differences that are across children. We have a one size fits all approach, but MTSS is going to say we're going to identify children who need supports right away and do it systematically. And then the other 2 points under MTSS, we use data to match children's strengths and their needs to interventions of varying intensities. And we're going to provide those interventions within a continuum of evidence-based practices. So unlike what Judy and I see in many high quality but not evidence-based programs, is simply doing things that philosophically make sense to the providers. And we're saying we have evidence bases around what our practices ought to be. This slide helps, we think, helps convey the ideas around having several different levels of intensity of the interventions that might be provided. Those interventions, again, can be either directed towards more traditional early academic targets. They might be interventions that are around social, emotional, and behavioral areas, as well as other coping skills that children would need to perform in their settings to be successful children moving on to successful young adulthood. We see tiers 1, 2, and 3, with tiers becoming increasingly intensive and increasingly more individualized. And I think we'll move on from there to kind of share with you a little bit about the various components of MTSS, and that we're really only going to highlight just a couple of them now, but we do see MTSS including all 7 of these hexagons. But we're going to focus right now just a little bit on universal screening and progress monitoring. And then we're going to get to talking about your questions in just a minute more. So one of the ways to conceptualize the particular intensity of interventions that would be available is to consider how the pyramid model, which is a very well regarded, well-known model for provision of social emotional supports. It's preventative as well as having a strong intervention component, and it has these different levels which very well describe the kinds of supports and structures that parents and family members and the administrators and leaders and practitioners would see that would be very necessary. That blue level is kind of what is often looked at as tier 1, where you're going to focus on those high quality relationships and nurturing supportive environments, which are going to be great for preventing difficulties, as well as in the targeted social emotional supports and then more intensive interventions as well. One of the points we want to highlight is that in past years, many people have said to us, well, isn't an MTSS or RTI Model 1 where you have to work through the tiers, that you can't get to the highest level of intervention unless you have tried earlier tiers? And that is simply a falsehood and a misconception we want to make clear right now. If children are identified that need the most intensive interventions possible, you're going to provide those right away, and you are not going to ask any parent or any child to simply be to have a failure with earlier levels of intervention. So that's why we say, one of the reasons why we say this kind of MTSS system is so useful and vital to meet the needs of young children and families, because you're going to put intensive or more targeted supports in place. Whatever is best to meet that child's need is going to be what you're going to put in place, and not wait for any kind of a wait to fail model. It didn't work in K-12 MTSS and RTI systems, and it's not going to work in early MTSS either. So the two core components of the 7 we want to mention briefly is this universal screening. So you want to make sure that you are doing an assessment with either curriculum-based measures or curriculum-based assessments, or your general preschool screening measures to take a closer look at whether or not your core instruction is being effective. You may have some children coming to you that have not been identified previously because the pandemic is bringing about changes in their behavior that are worrisome to their caregivers and family members. So in that case, you might be pairing universal screening with a developmental screening. And you're going to be looking at which students and families need more supports and services and what changes should be made in order to ensure success. And then we won't talk about it in detail in this webinar, but there's also a very strong need to make sure that you're doing progress monitoring when those children are identified and when you're offering supports and services, so that you can make sure the children are successful and that you continue to revise and review when students need a more or less intensive amount of support. This is a slide I think we'll kind of go past, just because I know it's already 1:23 and we want to get to talking about some more of those types of interventions that might be in place. We've talked a little bit about universal screening, knowing that the purpose is primarily to look at how well that core curriculum is working. And that although I mentioned universal screening and developmental screening in kind of the same sentence, they are two really different processes, but we think there's going to be a heightened need for both of those separate processes to look and see how well that core curriculum is meeting children's needs who are already in services, and then to make sure that the developmental screening is also available in your communities to identify children who may not previously have been identified, and to also get them in appropriate services. We know that one of the ways of defining universal screening is that they're going to be brief tools, brief assessments. They are not like the kinds of tools you would look at to determine if a child needed early childhood special education services or needed an IEP. We wanted to talk as well about some of the kinds of tier 2 supports, knowing that children are likely to have an increase in some challenging behaviors, whether that's more acting out behaviors or more internalized behaviors, behaviors that are going to be of concern to families. So we wanted to just mention there are 2 different ways that you can look at providing additional supports to young children. You can do some things that would be considered a problem-solving approach, which is individualized, and you look to see that the students' strengths are identified as well as their needs, and you meet those needs through some targeted strategies, such as explicit instruction around the skills and competencies they need to be more successful, to be more engaged, and to better demonstrate their adaptive skills, to have increased opportunities to respond to instruction using more adult models in addition to peer models, but maybe having more adult models because peer models are not always as pure and as exact as you want them to be, and that this problem-solving approach can be used to address social, emotional, or a pre-academic area. The second way that we see putting together tier 2 options would be looking at what we call a standard protocol approach, meaning you might identify a group of children that have common needs in any given area, and then you provide an evidence-based approach to all those children, very often in small group instruction or in small group approaches. So there's, I think, a slide coming up that shares a couple of the ways in which we see tier 2 interventions being available. Some of these that are listed. There's Story Friends. There's I don't see the name of the one that's Laura Justice and Anita McGinty. I don't remember that one by name, but the icon is there for their work. Developing Talkers is another option that you would have. These are mostly for individuals that would have difficulties within the early literacy and language domain. And then there's the Path to Literacy as well as Story Champs. So those are some options for tiers 2. And then there are also several things that are referenced in chapter 7 of our book, which you will learn about near the end of our quick coffee chat. But there's things like Best in Class, as well as Paths, The Incredible Years, and then the First Step and Second Step are some of the better known standard protocol approaches for being able to provide tier 2 interventions in the social, emotional, and behavioral areas. And of course,
Robin, one
yes.
thing that I would just add here is that we have all of these tier 2 interventions listed in our resources, and so if you want to learn more about them, you can find the websites in our resources page.
Right, and I think Amy might be able to help the viewers know just how they can access that page, whether it's, I'll let Amy describe at the end how they can access that separate Word document of those resources. That would be great. So again, progress monitoring, we would continue to make sure that whatever interventions we initiate for students, that we're continuing to monitor that students and child's progress in that intervention so that we make sure that they are making the progress they need. As they become very, very proficient, we can remove some of those intensive supports. If they're not highly successful, we increase supports. That this is something that occurs in an MTSS system, which we do not see happening in the more typical way that early childhood is provided to young children, that it is more of a one-size-fits-all. And we think that this MTS kind of system it would be a great match for meeting the needs of young children and their families who are adversely impacted by the pandemic. So I think, Judy, you were going to maybe take on that closing thoughts slide, and why don't you go ahead and do that, and then we'll let Amy think about if this would be a good time for that polling that we need to do.
Sure. So I guess just to wrap up a lot of the thoughts that we wanted to share with you today is we know that some of the most vulnerable children suffer the most and will suffer the longest from the pandemic. And I realize that those of you who are in charge of preschool programs or will be teachers in programs that will be reopening in the fall, we don't know what the learning environments for our preschoolers will be like, but we know that we need to be ready. And what we wanted to share with you today is that we think that MTSS offers some of the tools that can really be helpful as we start thinking about how to provide children with the most appropriate level of support and instruction. So we do have some tools at our disposal through MTSS to help us with some of the challenges that we're going to be facing in our preschool programs in the fall. And that's what we wanted to share with you today. As I mentioned before, we knew we couldn't put everything we wanted to into these small number of minutes that we had to share with you, but we leave you with a lot of resources. Our book on MTSS is available through Paul Brooks. We also have lots of examples of interventions that can be used in MTSS, and some of them I think can be especially helpful in teaching remotely. Examples of universal screening and progress monitoring. And then I think Amy was going to mention this giveaway.
Great. Thank you, Judy. Thanks, Robin. Yes, so listeners, on the screen, you'll see the book that Judy and Robin wrote, and we're giving 3 lucky listeners a copy of the book. So we're going to, from everyone listening live, we're going to randomly select 3 of you, and we will email the winners afterwards. We're also, if you'll just move forward the next slide, we are giving a 20% discount. So Coffee Talk is the code, and you can use it for any product on the Brooks website. Judy and Robin's book, and also some of the resources like Path to Literacy and Story Friends that were recommended are also published by Brooks. So I encourage you to check those out. We've been having coffee chats throughout the whole month of April and May. So we're just wrapping up. I think Friday is our last scheduled one for now, but we're planning on continuing this because we've enjoyed it so much in the fall, I think. But we have an archive of all 20 coffee chats we've held so far, so I encourage you to check that out for other topics. And then also we created a page of COVID-19 resources that might be helpful during this time period. So we have some other webinars, some activity handouts for parents that you might find helpful. So if you'll go forward just one more slide, Judy, there'll be a link, or maybe not. So I can I'll send that link out afterwards. You can get to it from, if you go to the Brooks homepage, there's a COVID-19, we've added it to our header, so you can click that and see it, but I'll send it out in the follow-up email as well. So
Great.
now if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and type that into the chat, and then I think we're going to just take some polls. Judy, do you want me to launch the first one?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm launching, we're interested in just hearing, what do you think the most typical way preschool instruction will be carried out in your local area in the fall? So if you'll choose just one of those options, and we'll give you a few seconds to respond. We know it's really just your best guess at this time. Okay, so about 40% of the people have voted so far, so I'll just keep it open for just another 5 or so seconds. Okay, so I'm gonna close it now and I'll share the results. So on your screen, you should be seeing, so it looks like 50% or so people think it's gonna be a hybrid, 36% are expecting in-person instruction, and 12% are expecting all remote instruction. So thank you for sharing that. And then the next poll is just this is kind of a two-part question. We divided it up. So as you're thinking about when preschools are reopening in the fall, if you'll just choose the issues you think that are important for programs that early childhood programs might need guidance on.
I'd say most important.
Most important. Yes, all of these are important.
Yeah.
So choose all that you think are the most important. Okay, I'm seeing some votes come in. I'll just keep it a few more. This one's a harder question, I think, because all of these are important.
While people are doing their voting, one thing that I wanted to mention, that in the resource handout that we've included, we've also listed some specific resources for supporting children's social emotional development during the pandemic, resources for supporting dual language learners, and also resources for remote learning, and also some for engaging families during COVID-19.
Okay, so I'm sharing the results now. It looks like two options are very close as the most important. So supporting children with challenging behaviors or social emotional needs, and tier 1 social emotional support to help children adjust to our new normals. Those are both very close. And then I'll launch our last question, is kind of a second part of that, just some other issues to think about, and which of these you think are the most important for the fall that programs need guidance for. Okay, I see votes coming in. We'll leave it just a couple, about 10 more seconds. All right, great. I'll share this. Thank you everyone for participating. It looks like, again, two options are pretty close. The monitoring children's progress and then making sure children are safe and secure at home, both came in over 50% or just above 50%. So thank you for sharing. So if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and type them in. So I have a few questions that I'm seeing about getting the handouts. So the handouts are in the webinar, the handout section of your webinar panel. And then also I put links in the chat box. So if you find your chat box, you can find links, and they'll also be in the follow-up email tomorrow. We'll include links. Okay, so let's take some questions. Okay, so We have one listener who's asking, are there any changes in recommendations for schools with larger numbers of culturally and linguistically diverse students, students eligible for um, English language services in particular, or for schools that find screeners lead to disproportionate numbers of students eligible for EL services? So I guess any changes in recommendations for schools?
Well, I guess one of the things that I would mention is that we know that that uh, uh, in terms of best practices for assessing children from who do not have English as their primary language, we know that best practice is assessing them in English and in their home language. So one of the things that we want to do is learn about what they know and be able to express in their home language, and not penalizing children because they're not speaking English. So we want to be able to be able to combine information from both their home language and their knowledge of English in order to know what level of instructional support they need.
Great, thank you. Um, let's see. We have a question about screeners and what screeners are most adaptable for virtual administration during this time. Do you have recommendations? And
Well,
intervention products, so both screeners and intervention products.
Robin, do you want to take that first, or would you
Well,
like me?
let me chime in just a little bit, and I'll be brief, and then you can add in, Judy. One of the caveats and cautions I would make sure to share with the families of children who have concerns is to ask questions about how that screening process is going to take place before you start filling out checklists or try to make your child available through some kind of a video conference. We need to make sure that we are finding a way, as each of the individual states moves forward into these different phased openings, that we are helping young children to feel very comfortable and helping parents feel comfortable. I think it's okay if maybe a trained person from a school staff talks with a family member through video, but I know that there are concerns being expressed by all different members of the professions who engage in assessment of young children about whether or not we can say that because I can see a child through a video conference that I can really conduct an accurate assessment of their strengths and their needs. So I think that needs to be stated, first of all, that we know young children do not typically perform that well in the older fashioned individualized means of gathering information. So we might have to have multiple times. It might not be that you see a child for just 15 minutes and that you say that you know exactly what kind of a classroom they might need, or you know exactly what their strengths are. We might need to take more time to get to know a child and their family members over multiple opportunities, to find ways where you can either do still social distancing, but you observe a child acting in a very home-like setting, but you can see that child from afar. At times when I've been challenged with children who wouldn't speak to me, more selectively mute children, there are ways that I was able to watch them interact with their family members so that I could gather information about their strengths with their family members that they wouldn't necessarily show to me if I was that unfamiliar person coming to get to know them. So I think parts of that process are going to have to be reconsidered by professionals, and we're going to need to take some time as professionals to think about how we can gather the best information to make good decisions, and to remember that we can always go back. If we say that there's a child that's past a screening, we can say to that family, this is a decision that we're coming to all together with you, and we will come back to it again 2 or 3 months later. That no decision you make is going to be hard and fast, whether it is to provide supports that then need to be taken away because the child was actually somewhat more capable than initially thought, or if a child appears to be okay but then later has challenges, that we can always go back and reconsider those screening decisions. So, and you have some other specific ideas for people, Judy, beyond that kind of caveat about how the screening process might need to change?
Well, I guess another big caveat is that since these measures weren't developed and developed for virtual circumstances,
Right.
they really aren't valid delivered that way. And so we have to just use them and proceed with caution, and realize.
Right.
I think realize sometimes in situations like this, we don't have to go for perfection in terms of the measures
Right.
that we have. But if what we're trying to do is identify the children who have the most urgent needs, using the tools that we have as best we can, seeing how children function as a result of the level of intervention that we give them, monitor
Right.
the progress and make adjustments. So we kind of have to, as you said, learn how well we're identifying children through the screening process, okay? Allowing children to develop and perform and learn, and then see how they progress over time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy and Robin. I have a
Sure.
question about school psychologists in particular. So school psychologists are encouraged to immediately provide short-term intense interventions and then determine which student is not meeting the expected effects based on those interventions. Do you have any suggestions for the sort of interventions can be great for this early childhood group?
Well, I wish I had more information on this, Amy, as I'm a nationally certified school psychologist and have been for almost 40 years. And so I'm not certain about the foundation of the assumption in the question. And if the person is someone saying that they would be a team member who would be getting to know a group of young children as a part of children that are coming together again in a school setting, or if they are thinking about doing something that would be in a virtual format. So I think for me, as both a school psychologist who's conducted small group instruction and as a person in charge of teacher preparation, I think we need to combine how we would look at evidence-based practices in terms of those nurturing relationships, to look at how the environment is set up, to look at what kind of skill development is being provided. Is there embedded instruction going on? Is there appropriate explicit instruction for the competencies that really can be taught that way? So it's beyond, I think, what we could reply to in a smaller coffee chat. It might be something that would be a part of a bigger conversation, either within the school psychology community of practice or within our early childhood special ed community of practice, to flesh out more what those contexts would be of that person's question.
Great, thank you.
And I would just add that it sounds like what the listener that posed the question was asking was really about tier 2 interventions, and the tier 2 interventions that we have identified and put into our resource list are ones that have been validated as being able to show short-term progress over time. Many of them have been validated through randomized trials, and so we put a lot of faith and expectation on these tier 2 interventions. And so I would look at these as first choices.
Great, thank you. So we're kind of approaching our end of our time. We're a little over. I'm just going to take one last question. Are there any recommendations for how to best support parents in engaging their children in learning during this time of remote learning? Do you have any thoughts for our listeners? I know it's a struggle that many teachers are facing right now.
Do you want to start that, Judy, or do you want me to just share one or two thoughts?
Why don't you jump in and I'll follow.
Okay. I think when we want to ask ourselves about how to engage young children, we really need to think about how to make the activity as enticing as possible. There are a lot of resources around embedding what instruction we really want them to participate in within their daily routines and activities.
Yeah.
So that can be a great way. I think Patricia Snyder at the University of Florida has a number of resources that she's developed with her colleagues around how to take your natural routines of the day and to embed very purposeful, intentional questioning of children, providing them with opportunities to explore and to then come up with answers and manipulations of objects and activities using your whole body, so that children are engaged very purposefully and intentionally in learning new skills without it necessarily having to be to sit down at a table with a paper and pencil and have a parent or another caregiver dictate things that they're somehow supposed to be doing. So I think embedding instruction is a great way for families to move ahead. I think if you have something you specifically want your child to learn and you want to do it more explicitly, making the materials very friendly to the student, building on their interests, taking the things that they're already proficient in and building another generalization or building a different way of looking at the things that they're already doing well would be advisable, rather than unfamiliar routines, moving them to a different part of the house that they really don't operate in, setting up a situation or an environment that's unfamiliar, using different language. You want to make it as friendly and as much fun as you can for that child.
Yeah, I would definitely concur with that recommendation, Robin, that I think the more that we can help parents figure out how they can be addressing children's learning objectives through their everyday routines, making different regular family activities be learning opportunities is probably going to be most successful, because those are the kinds of things that families can maintain over time and do on a regular basis. And so, thinking of everyday life activities as learning opportunities will be most, I think, most beneficial. And so I would give that general recommendation, and then just point our listeners to a couple of resources that I have specifically on our resource list for engaging families. So there's one from the National Center for Families Learning, and there are also some resources for remote learning from the Family, Infant, and Parent Program that has a lot of great resources about what they call early childhood intervention telepractice. And then another just great resource from the Boston Public Schools Department of Early Learning.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Judy and Robin, for answering questions and for your coffee chat. And thank you to everyone who joined us today listening. You'll receive an email tomorrow with the link to your recording and your certificate. And I'll include links to the resources, the slide handouts, and the list of resources that Judy and Robin put together. So
Amy,
thank you very much.
I say one more thing?
Of
I
course.
just wanted to let everyone know that if there are those of you who are interested in early MTSS, there is a community of practice that has been meeting virtually about every other month, and it's people who are program directors, teachers, and state level administrators that have been talking about, how do we do early MTSS? And so if any of you are interested in joining that community of practice, I encourage you to reach out to me at my email at carta, C-A-R-T-A, @ku.edu. And want to welcome you into the fold, and thank you all for joining us today.
Great. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.